Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So if you're watching this video today, consider yourself lucky. Why is that? Well, because the sun recently unleashed a flurry of coronal mass ejections, Earth-facing coronal mass ejections, which have triggered a solar hurricane of sorts, which is causing geomagnetic storms around the Earth, which have the potential to cripple the power grid. 2020 was the beginning of a lot of bad things, including a new solar cycle, which is set to peak in 2025, meaning that these solar storms are going to become more frequent and more intense. Why is this important? Well, it's important because we are now more grid bound than ever before. There are more satellites than the previous solar cycle, and it's only a matter of time before we see another Carrington event which completely decimates the power grid. This is not fiction, this is not sci-fi, this is an absolute fact. Stick with me, let's talk about it. So if you're not aware, there are these things called coronal mass ejections, which are these bursts of plasma which are emitted from the sun in increasing regularity at the peak of the sun's solar cycle. The sun goes through 11-year solar cycle, and at the high point of that cycle is when you get the most solar activity. What does that mean to us? Well, what it means is that if there is a solar storm that's so intense that it is able to circumvent our geomagnetic barrier that surrounds the Earth. The Earth has a magnetic field which protects us from the most harmful effects of the sun, including the effects of coronal mass ejections. But sometimes, if these are so powerful, they can circumvent the Earth's magnetic field, and they can cause these geomagnetic storms, which can potentially cause the power grid to be disrupted. So if you watch my channel for a while, you probably know what an electromagnetic pulse is. This can be caused by one of three things. It can be caused by a coronal mass ejection, it can be caused by a high altitude nuclear warhead, or a low altitude, but the effects wouldn't be felt as far. The real risk that people talk about in science fiction and what preppers prepare for is the high altitude nuclear warhead, which is detonated right outside the stratosphere, that is going to have the effect of basically disabling most electronics within a line of sight. There's also EMP weapons, okay, more rare, and I don't know if these are used in conventional military. Nobody really knows, but all you need to know is that these things do exist. They're very credible and real threats. Now, what you don't have to worry about with the coronal mass ejection induced electromagnetic pulse is you don't have to worry about your smaller electronics being fried. This is because the pulse of a solar flare, CME I should say, is only going to be coupled into larger power lines, larger conductors, okay, larger circuits. These smaller circuits would be compromised by the E1 aspect of a high altitude nuclear warhead, but I don't want to get overly specific. All you need to know is that the power grid is at extreme risk of catastrophic failure as a result of these geomagnetic storms. What you really need to understand is this, is that they have the ability to foresee whether or not these storms are going to be intense, and they can preemptively shut down certain aspects of the grid, and they can take these transformers offline. Because if you're not aware, what the worst possible scenario is that one of the thousands of transformers which regulates the power to and from the power plants to your home gets blown out, okay, or gets compromised beyond repair. And these things can take a long time to repair. We're talking about years. And that's in a fully functioning, healthy supply chain. Okay, that's not in a world which is thrown into disarray because of all the other stuff which is going on top of having different parts of the grid being shut down. Now, it's important to understand that certain power grids may be affected, others may not be affected. But because we live in such a globally networked world, even if 10% of the world's power grid was compromised, hell, even 1%, okay, could cause a bottleneck, which could lead to more problems upon all the other problems we're currently experiencing. Now, one of my main concerns with engineers' ability to preemptively shut down the power grid is that, number one, not a lot of countries are going to want to take that chance, because that would mean shutting down production for a day or two. For some countries, if you're talking about countries like the United States, that's $50 to $100 billion of potential productivity, which would have to be totally halted, not counting all of the unrest which might arise as a result of a nationwide preemptive blackout in order to stop the harmful effects. Because what you want to do is you want to take the transformers offline so they don't blow. You can do this. You can foresee a solar flare coming, although you're never going to know with absolute certainty what the effects of the coronal mass ejection are going to be. So it may take out the power grid, but it may not. And there's going to be a lot of debate as to whether or not it will. And then, of course, you're always going to have those skeptics, people who think that, oh, this is just the government's way to try to control everything. And herein lies the problem, right? With all of these catastrophes, you're always going to have that subset of the population that's not going to believe anything. So if you start doing forced power grid shutdowns, there's going to be a lot of people who have a problem with that. There's going to be a lot of resistance to that. And not many countries are going to want to do that, because that's going to put you obviously at a disadvantage, not only from an economic production aspect, but also in a militaristic aspect. Okay, obviously the military is prepared to deal with EMP, or I should say most militaries in the world probably have contingency plans and are probably hardened for EMP, but the civilian infrastructure is not. And of course, the military infrastructure is plugged in to the civilian infrastructure. So if forecasters are able to identify that there's a potential devastating inbound geomagnetic storm which is going to compromise the power grid, the question remains, are they going to do anything about it because of the public backlash? And do the appropriate protocols even exist legally, politically, for something like that to actually be enacted? I don't know. It's going to vary from country to country. Now, something like this did happen in Quebec. I believe it was in the late 90s. Knocked out the power grid for 9 hours. But that's just one example of how this doesn't have to affect the entire planet. It could affect one place, which is a central hub. If it affects the East Coast, okay, the East Coast power grid, it may not affect the West Coast. It may not affect the Texas power grid. It may not affect the Canadian power grid. It may just affect somewhere in Europe. And of course, that is going to ripple out in terms of the economic effects. Now, I need to emphasize how serious something like this would be. We are talking about the potential for a large chunk of the power grid to be turned off for years, okay? The loss of life which would ensue has been estimated. I've heard estimates of up to 90%. Now, that's in the case of a worst case, massive solar hurricane which disabled the entire North American power grid. In that case, you're going to have a lot of casualties, because think about what's going to happen if you can't get electricity to the places that need it most. Again, your smaller electronics are probably going to be okay. Your off-grid renewable energy systems, your solar panels, they might be okay. It's the bigger grid. Anything that's plugged into the grid is potentially going to have its circuits fried, and that could potentially be a big problem. Now, if the pandemic was any indication of what might happen in one of these scenarios where even a part of the power grid was compromised, you're going to have the military in the streets, because the first thing that's going to happen is the breakdown of rule of law. If there's no lights, you guys remember the power outage in New York City in the 1970s, I believe it was? It was a couple nights of crazy looting and rioting. Now imagine that happening in a world which has already been financially depressed by the events of the last 18 months. The government would be extremely limited with the resources that it could bring to bear to deal with the situation at hand. We would find ourselves in a situation where things would need to be rationed. You would likely be given some kind of ration card. Fuel would definitely need to be rationed. The only way that transformers could effectively be rebuilt if there was some measure of extreme law and order implemented in order to curb whatever social unrest is going to arise in those situations, and everything else is going to flare up in a situation like that. Imagine a world with essentially no internet. That's what we're talking about here. I know for some people that's the end of the world, but just think about how dependent we now are on something as trivial in the grand scheme of things as the internet, not only to get information. Some people might say that that's the best thing that could happen to the world at this point in time. No more social media, people going outside and actually having to talk with their neighbors. Could be a mixed blessing, who knows? Until, of course, people started running out of food, which they will, because you need energy in order to get food. This is the kind of event that they say happens once every 100 years. I believe the probability of it happening every decade is 12%. So we are definitely long overdue for a major Carrington event. If you don't know what a Carrington event is, go watch my litany of EMP videos. I've interviewed NASA engineers like Arthur T. Bradley. I've done countless videos about electromagnetic pulse and mini documentaries of sorts. So definitely go and check those out if you want more information than what I'm providing here today. But this is one of those big long burn situations that we do prepare for. If something like this were to happen, it would be the pandemic times 10, I would say, because there would be way more crime. Okay, there's going to be way more supply chain disruptions. You're likely not going to have the information avenues that you have right now, or if you did, bandwidth is going to be extremely restricted. Only people who had an alternative power source would likely be able to access it. This is why ham radio is so important, why having alternate means of communication is so important, and having an alternate power source or a way to store power, be it solar, wind turbine, even kinetic energy generators like the KTOR power box, things of that nature. Now, if you recall, I did a video about a year and a half ago. I can't remember all the details of it, but I know Trump approved some initiative to harden the power grid against EMP. But that was supposed to take many years to come to maturity. And I think it was scrapped by the Biden administration recently, but don't quote me on that. I know that Obama also put some things into play, but this threat has never truly been taken that seriously by anyone in the government. So my concern, though, is going to be the deniability that comes into play here, because you're going to have a lot of people who don't trust the government. And if the government starts saying, hey, we need to shut the power down at various times because of increased solar activity up to the year 2025, when we know that there's going to be all sorts of other stuff going on, cyber attacks, okay, climate shifts, weather anomalies, things of that nature, on top of the pandemic and the possible wars and whatever else might arise. To put it this way, not many people are going to trust the government, and I do think that that's going to lead to big problems. Now, there's a couple articles. I'll post links in the description to these. These are by reputable news sources, okay? Bloomberg, Fizzorg, which is a very popular, it's not a journal, but it's a kind of like a Scientific American of sorts. They provide mainstream synopses of various scientific findings. And solar storms are back, threatening life on Earth as we know it. You should know that the effects of a coronal mass ejection can take a couple days to get here from the sun. So it doesn't travel at the speed of light. Anyways, I'm going to post links to these articles in the description section below. But one part here I really want to emphasize is where they talk about the Carrington event. And I've talked about this, but it's really important to help people put this in perspective, okay? The most powerful geomagnetic storm ever recorded resulted in the 1859 Carrington event, when telegraph lines electrified, zapping operators and setting offices ablaze in North America and Europe, and basically around the world wherever there was telegraphs at the time. If a storm of that magnitude were to hit today, it would likely cut power to millions, if not billions, of people. Okay, so try to understand that for a second. There was very few power lines back in those days, just telegraphs. And the amount of energy taken up by those telegraph lines was enough to actually zap the operators. So imagine what kind of devastation would be unleashed on the grid today on these larger transformers in particular, of which there is no protection right now. Okay, they're talking about how it would probably take around $30 billion to harden the grid for this, and maybe that's going to be an initiative that they're going to undertake. So the fact is, while there are certain things we can do to mitigate this, none of those things are foolproof, and there's really nothing being done about this right now. So that's just another reason why you need to prepare. Again, if this were to happen 150 years ago, when we all had farms and we all had cows and chickens and the population was 1/7 of what it was today, wouldn't be a big deal in the grand scheme of things. In fact, nobody would notice. You would just get a really nice Aurora Borealis light show for a couple nights, but that would be about the extent of it. Nowadays, when we're all dependent on this, it would hit the fan. So all the more reason to be prepared. The main things you have to do are the things we always talk about on this channel. Get your food preps locked down, have a water source, have a means to grow your own food if possible, have as much prescription medication as you can at all times, have a means of self-defense, and if you do have disposable income, look into getting a power source, because it absolutely will be useful, even just for the psychological comfort that electricity can provide with the amenities it provides. So I just wanted to throw my 2 cents in on that. This is not something that you need to lose sleep over, but just know this is something that could happen at any time. It's something which we would get very little warning if it was going to happen. And even though they can possibly mitigate it, there would be a debate about whether or not they should. It would be very similar to the conundrum of the Russians and the US and, did they fire a missile at us? Should we, fire back? Should we disable the power grid? Should we not? It's going to be one of those types of situations. So the number one thing I'm personally worried about with something like this would be the whole never let a catastrophe go to waste aspect of it. And we all know what that usually entails. That usually entails the government not letting a good crisis go to waste. What would that look like in this instance? I don't know. Let's heat up the comment section below. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Stay safe, stay ready, and don't forget, there is no finish line. The work never ends. You always got to be getting better. You always got to be getting more self-reliant. Bolster those preps. Get ready, because the day is coming. Let's hope it doesn't, but if it does, we're ready. Thanks for watching, guys. Canadian Prepper out. The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com. Your one-stop shop for premium, high-quality, brand-name products that have been tried and tested by myself and other YouTube gear reviewers. My subscribers save 10% off by using the coupon code SurvivalPrepper. All one word in all caps.